Before we start, I forgot to mention, if you haven't listened to this tune, Smog, then I've linked it below. If you listen to it first, this will make a lot more sense. So track 5 on the EP is Smog, and it's by far the most classical piece on the album. I wrote this for a project called Symbiosis in 2021. That project was about how different species connected to each other, both in good and bad ways, basically. And Smog was a piece that was highlighting climate change and our relationship to our own world and the man-made world and the natural world. And it was really about how smog as a metaphor really represented climate change well, I think, because it was this visual, very visual representation of mankind basically faking nature. We make our own weather in cities with smog, and it's kind of a disturbing reminder of what it is. So Smog is the only piece that doesn't have any improvisation, so it really leans into the classical sound. The main inspirations for this were Philip Glass, mainly his piece, well, his opening from his album Glassworks, the opening and closing. At the time I was writing this, I was really into the score from Parasite. I mean, the film as well, but I found the score really interesting. Borrowed a lot from that. And I think also some earlier composers, so Rachmaninoff and Chopin, definitely influenced the initial writing process, but as the piece became more developed, I moved away more from that late romantic kind of classical harmony. And I think the last influence was probably Muse. They're basically my favorite band, and I think that's where a lot of the Rachmaninoff and Chopin influence comes from as well, because they really use those composers in their music as well. So the way I started writing this piece was at the piano, and I actually just recorded using my voice memo app. I actually just found that first recording, which is me trying to fumble my way around some vague idea in my head, which I can play here. So me faffing around, trying to understand what I'm doing. The later development in this piece, the middle section, I didn't record on voice memo. That was just basically me very slowly improvising around the chords, but I'll talk about that in a second. So the structure for this piece is a little unusual. There isn't a distinct A section, B section, C section. But if you're to put it broadly into sections, we have the main theme, which is very slowly presented and then varied. We have this middle section where the bass and the saxophone play in unison, and that's the part which I call is the wandering section, because the harmony really wanders around and goes on this journey. And then after that, the theme varies again and then is presented in its final form with everyone playing it. And the very last section is when the idea in the wandering section, the second section, is then played on its own with just piano. So there are basically two main ideas which are used through the whole piece. It's based on just these two principles. First is this melodic motif, which gets varied through the whole piece, and that sounds like this. The second idea is this very minimal movement in chords. So there are 5 chords which make up the basic structure of this piece, those being G minor, E flat, this is kind of B flat sus, to B flat, and then finally to D, and that repeats many times. But if you look at how those chords are coming about, it's basically moving one note at a time. So even if you don't know what these chords are, you can just watch my hands. So it's only that last chord to the D where 2 notes move. The other ones are all moving one note at a time. And that was probably one of the main ideas I wanted to explore in this piece and use to a more significant effect in this middle wandering section, where although the harmony moves through all these different key centers and unrelated chords, it still sort of makes sense because we're only moving one, sometimes two notes at a time. So the whole first section of this piece is basically setting up this idea and using these two principles that we talked about because they carry through the rest of the piece. And if I didn't take this time to set up those ideas, then this slightly odd structure of the piece wouldn't really work because it just wouldn't make any sense. So it begins with just the piano playing this repeating pattern. Also, just a quick note about this pattern. This idea that you hear at the start, it's very common and it's very effective, and it's been used so much that it's almost become a cliche. But I think its simplicity really draws you in. And so to try and avoid that cliche, there are a number of things you can do to make it your own and to make it a little bit different. One of the pieces that inspired me when I was writing this was Philip Glass's opening to his album Glassworks. He uses a similar idea, but he uses rhythm to make it more interesting. So if we were to play his piece without an interesting rhythm, it would just be like this. Which is fine, like it works, it's cool. But he makes it more interesting and able to last longer because he uses what's called a polyrhythm. So basically there are 3 notes in the space of 2 notes, and it gives you this sort of bouncy back and forth feeling. And I think that gives it a little more longevity. This piece for Smog, I decided to use harmony as the thing to make this a little more interesting. And it was really that second principle that I talked about that allowed me to do that. So when we get to this second section, this wandering section, that's when the harmony changes a lot. So we've been just playing these 5 chords for a few minutes, and it really needs a change now to make it more interesting. And so that section begins just after the violin finishes the melody. So this chord here, which is B minor, isn't related to the key we've just been in, which was G minor. You can hear there's a big difference. But when we come from this chord, which is D, those chords are related. So it allows us to transition or pivot into this key. You could also talk about parallel keys and things here, but basically they're kind of related, and that's why you're allowed to pivot between them. So this whole middle section, this wandering section, is basically using that same principle of moving only 1 note, sometimes 2 at a time. I find this a really fun way of composing because I'm not thinking about music theory. I'm just thinking about, if I move 1 finger, where does that take me? And it allows you to go and move between very unrelated keys, and you don't have to think about it in this theoretical way. You're just executing it, and it's very exploratory. So we begin here, and I'm just going to play each of the chords so you can see how little movement there is between each of them. And that takes us back to our home key of G minor. We started here, and we ended up here. Now, because we've been only using this one melodic idea in different variations, this one. It's also time to vary that as well. So at this point, myself on bass and Matt on sax, we play this melody in unison in the lower register of our instruments, which makes for a nice contrast between the violin having just played the melody up here. So that references what's come before, but it's different enough as well. So if I were to write something just completely unrelated, it wouldn't really work. But because I'm still referencing the melodic idea, it sort of makes sense, even though the chords are different, the key is different, the melody is mostly different. So having these melodies in the bass register is the sound I really enjoy, and I heard it a lot in the Parasite score. And in the Parasite score, there's a similar idea where we have a pattern in the right hand of the piano, and then we have a melody in the left hand. So when you put those together, and it's a sound I really like in this context as well. The composer Jung Jaeil is using dissonance in a really nice way, and that's something I want to emulate as well. For instance, when he does this, we get this crunchy sound. And then on this chord, which is quite a brave thing to do at the very opening of a film, but it's something I really like, and it immediately sets the tone. And so I used a similar idea in this wandering section of the piece, where me and Matt are playing. I actually use almost identical, those few notes. Compare this to this. So after this wandering section, we hear something similar to what we heard earlier in the piece, which is this idea of the variation on that initial theme. But this time, instead of just setting up what's going to happen in the piece, this is now building into the climax that culminates in the melody being played by Irene, Bernadette, and Matt, which is violin, voice, and saxophone. And it's quite a powerful moment because it's the first time we hear voice. We've heard the other instruments before, but having this voice suddenly appear, I think, is quite powerful. I wanted this climax to be quite powerful, but not too dramatic, because basically I'd say the highest point of the piece is when we go. I could have made this bigger by using a stronger chord. Basically, what's happening in the piano is instead of this, which is what the chords would be in their simpler form, I just do this. And we call that an inversion. And you'd think that if I wanted a big moment, I would use that effect by, at the end of the piece, going to. But I felt this was just a bit too dramatic compared to the rest of the piece, and I still wanted it to be, to keep this melancholic feel that goes throughout the whole piece. I don't want it to become too dramatic. It also sounds a bit like Star Wars. So I wanted to finish the piece in a way that was ambiguous and kind of melancholic and just open-ended. So originally this piece, which was part of the symbiosis suite that I talked about, at the end of Smog, that goes into another piece. But on its own, I still wanted it to work as well. To do that, I basically used the chords from the Wandering section, with this, these chords, and ending it on a really ambiguous chord. And this last chord, which is a D7, feels like it wants to resolve, but I just let it hang. And I think it leaves you wanting more, and it feels finished, but it's not finished. And I think it's just a nice way to end the piece, because I didn't want it to be too prescriptive, and I didn't want it to sound like it had ended, because this is about climate change as well. I wanted to have this kind of open-ended feeling that makes you think. Because I wrote this piece a couple of years ago, I can't really remember the ins and outs of how I wrote it in the same way that I had talked about in Horizon. But one of the nice things about Smog is it's one of those pieces that really flowed when I was writing it. Because often when I'm writing, it's a very stop-start process. There's a lot of trial and error, there's a lot of editing. And, you hear about composers and songwriters who can write these masterpieces in just one sitting, or you hear about the Beatles, Paul McCartney and John Lennon both talking about how they've had music come into their head and dreams and things, and I think that's really cool. I've never had that happen, but it is really nice when a piece just flows and it comes out. But it also means it's hard to remember, which is why I can't remember everything about how I wrote this piece, but I hope you find some value in what I've shared. So because for copyright reasons I can't share a lot of the music that inspired me, I'll put a link below to some of the pieces which I talked about earlier, and some other pieces which also inspire me to write this piece. So thanks for watching. If you want to support us, Bandcamp, Spotify, any way you can is really appreciated. And next week I'll be releasing a video about Talon, and see you then.